Welcome to the latest in our ImpactWayv podcast series, Short Waves Lasting Impact. I'm Karen Talamelli, and today we will be talking about the Plastics Treaty. Plastic pollution is a huge threat to the climate, to the ecosystem, as well as humanity. I can't think of a better guest to join me to discuss this issue than Doug Woodring, the founder of Ocean Recovery Alliance. Welcome back, Doug. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Hi, Karen. Thanks for having me again.
Oh, definitely, the pleasure is mine. So, the Plastics Treaty, could you just maybe address what it is and what does it hope to accomplish?
Sure. So the UN and over 190 countries a few years ago uh, pretty miraculously all decided very quickly in UN time standards that we should all have a treaty around curbing plastic pollution. If you think about it, there should be really no enemies for waste or pollution, period. So there should not be any lobbyists who are wanting this to happen. So all of the countries voted that we want a treaty, but no one yet knows what the treaty will look like. And they all agreed that by 2024, again, an extremely fast time frame, about 2 years. Usually UN treaties are 8 to 15 years long in negotiation and settlement and agreement on what the text is and how it's enforced. They agreed that this should happen in 2 years. So in the next 2 years, we have one session every 6 months where all of the stakeholders, all of the different governments and NGOs get together and try to hash out what this treaty is going to look like. Is it going to be about reduced use of plastic? Is it going to be taxation on plastic, alternatives to plastic, EPR laws, extended producer responsibility laws, of course, increased recycling, increased investment, all of these different things. And of course, you have many stakeholders in the kitchen, many cooks in the kitchen, from all varieties of the spectrum, which makes it pretty complicated and tough to figure out, how it's going to work and how it's going to be enforced. And is it going to be international law that governs every single country that signs on, or is it going to be all voluntary, based on how each country does it themselves in the right setting? And a lot of people don't really like that system because it's too slow and there might not be enough action by different countries. That's not just developing countries. It can easily be developed countries which are just as slow to come to the table and playing field. So in Paris, which will be the next meeting in end of May, and the one following that will be November in Nairobi. The Paris one will talk a lot about maybe the first kind of draft of ideas of what will happen. They had one in Uruguay in December. That was the very first treaty discussion, really to lay out the rules and the framework and how the negotiations will happen. So they didn't really get too much into the details of different ideas. Of course, there's many groups who have those ideas. But Paris will probably be more about those ideas and what they might look like and how they're enforced and how they're implemented, how the countries sign on to this once the agreement is hopefully made by all the countries. So it's definitely interesting. It's a fast track to a treaty and probably the fastest that the UN has ever done. All around this topic of plastic pollution, which, as you know, we think it's one of the most complicated environmental problems to solve, even more than climate change. Not that it's necessarily bigger in terms of impact and problems, but it's just very complex with all the types of plastic and material and melting points and colors and chemicals and all things included. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like the figures are staggering when you read that 14 million tons of plastic enters and damages aquatic ecosystems annually. It's amazing. And then just the greenhouse gas emissions that really affect everybody and increases global warming. To just again, the figures are staggering. The effect, but. Do you think that this treaty is the first time that governments have really come together to end plastic pollution on a global scale? Um, is just significant in and of itself, and was the plan that when these countries come back together in May in Paris, that everyone will basically have somewhat of a plan, at least a draft plan, to move forward?
Well, it is significant that they all agree that plastic pollution is not good for anyone. But of course, you have countries who are big producers of polymers, and they're big oil company countries who refine oil and petrochemicals. And as you said, plastic right now contributes about 7 or 8% of the global CO2 emissions just in its refining and production and extraction. That's compared to transportation, shipping, which is about 3%, airlines. But the challenge is that a lot of them want to keep producing. They want their brands and the companies to keep it being in business, and they want to keep making products, and those products come in packaging. And so the real challenge is, how do you limit this without making as much of an economic impact? And I think what we all have to realize is that the time is starting to come in the world that economic impact, benefits, and margins and good stock market valuation doesn't always mean that we're all better off, and that the world, there's many externalities that have never been paid for, never been accounted for, never been costed for, and plastic pollution is certainly one of those. So the ability for companies to keep producing many, many, many things that are not recycled. Most of them are recyclable, in fact, but most countries don't have the recycling infrastructure, or the systems, or the collection, or the cleaning to actually allow the recycling to happen. So it's not that they can't be recycled, it's that the countries don't have the recycling infrastructure. And the US is one of those. And so is Japan.
It's very developed countries that are included in that.
So is Australia. A lot of, one of the challenges that we all face in the West is that our labor costs are too high. And no one wants to be in this industry doing hand labor and hard labor. And that's the problem with the Western world for all kind of industries. So if you don't want to work in this industry and you have no people to work in it, do you do you burn your stuff in your own country and landfill it, or do you process it in the proper way with legitimate trade and legitimate companies that can do it with oversight, which didn't always happen before, but it's definitely can happen now, especially with a focus on plastic pollution, which was not, in the same way even 5 years ago. If we can't do it ourselves, I'm talking about the US and many Western countries, then we have our own problem. That's a social problem around labor and investment. We don't have the infrastructure. We only recycle about 28% of plastic bottles in the US. That is the easiest product to recycle, and it's the most valuable. And we only do 28%. So the US is no leader in this space at all. In fact, many developing countries are way ahead just because there's more value when people collect it in those countries and able to sell it. The U.S. infrastructure doesn't exist for that, and people are already relatively more well off, and they're not spending their time on this. But if we don't pay people to do this, we have to do it in other places. So when you look at the world today, many people have said recycling doesn't really work. It's not what it was meant to do. We're only getting 30 to 40% recycling of plastic in most countries, but globally the number is less than 15%. So imagine 85% of the inventory of plastic is still out there and not getting handled the right way for secondary use. When you look at the commitments of all the big brands have made in the last 3 years, they all want to use 20 to 30% recycled content in their packages and their products. And we've done a study, as have others. We believe in a few years there will be a 6 million ton shortfall in recycled content for all these big companies that want to use recycled content, but they can't get their hands on it. The countries don't have the processing, they don't have the collection, they don't have the relatively simple off-the-shelf machinery and equipment of grinders and shredders and cleaning and compactors that can get that material into the supply chain for the right type of processing. And I believe this is a very important sort of missed discussion so far in the plastic treaty. Most of the discussions to date have been punitive, meaning less use, more tax, alternative products. All of that is fine, and it will create some benefit, but by no means will it solve the problem. And then without a very large scale change in the way that recycling is propagated and scaled, we really won't solve this problem. So that means that we need to be able to trade material, and we need to think about circularity. Does circularity mean domestic circularity, or does it mean global circularity? And we would argue that it has to be global in the case of plastic, because most countries will not have their own capacity to collect, manage, sort, clean, and handle. Otherwise, if you force it on them, we're just causing everyone to replicate and spend extra money when other countries can do it better at scale in the right way. And if you force 190 countries to do it all by themselves separately, I believe it will never happen. And so that's a big challenge in the discussions that hasn't really been addressed yet.
And many of your initiatives and projects that we discussed have been not only significant, but groundbreaking and successful, because they're generally created without the need for bans, taxes, other legislation, getting the community involved, and to take that on a global scale, because recycling won't just end. It's got to be this life cycle approach. I think this quote, it came from you, which is pretty significant. The problem with plastic is that we are using a permanent material for disposable products. And, it's striking, it's significant. There is a lot of plastic out there. It doesn't go away by itself. I think I read that every toothbrush you've probably ever used that was plastic is still in existence. So the supply is there. It's just not being used effectively to get back into the system. Is
Right.
that a correct statement?
Yeah, it's exactly right. And this is the challenge. So, often you get nice big machinery and equipment out of the West, and they all want to go to big cities and put these big machines and digestives, machinery, and recycling and sorting. But they're way too big for 99% of all the villages and communities around the world.
Oh.
What you really need is 1 million small machines, which can do sorting and grinding and cleaning and compacting. Because as soon as you do that, You're creating many jobs. You're cleaning the local communities. Trash is localized, just like solar power. If you're in a sunny place, you have solar. If you have a windy place, you have wind. But if you're not in a windy place, you can't use wind power. But trash is where anyone lives, there's trash and waste. So you have to go to those places to sort it and aggregate it and process it a bit. You don't need big machines to do complex things, but you need to do enough to be able to get it into the market, to be able to sell it into the system where the big brands will be able to use it. So when you think about the north to south divide, and a lot of people think the north and the west has been exporting our plastic and our waste to the south. Well, that might have happened for processing, and it still might be the most advantageous way to do it if it's controlled. But when you think about companies and brands and what we export as products, we're selling these things to 180 countries, and it might be recyclable in California and France and UK and South Africa, but it might not be recyclable in all these other countries it goes to, just because they don't have the capacity and the resources. So now let's turn that on its head and capture this material from much of the South and get it to the brands and the companies in the North who all have made commitments to use it. And it's a 180-degree shift, but we've got to get the capacity, and we have to allow global trade to happen. The Basel Amendment on plastic trade came into effect in early 2021. It was not meant to stop trade of plastic feedstock for recycling, but the psychology and the media and a lot of environmental groups have just used the thinking that the trade of plastic means trade of waste and illegal, dirty material. And that did used to happen because people weren't focused on it. There was illicit trade, and that's not anything that anyone wants. But these last few years, that's really stopped. Even COVID put a stop to it because a lot of illicit recyclers who were just trading haphazard materials and didn't have the capacity to handle it went out of business because of COVID, because there was not this trade. So a lot of the riffraff and the bad things have gotten weeded out of the system. And now we need to recharge this idea and understand that global trade and circularity has to be allowed with legitimate trade across borders. And I think that's a very important part of this treaty, which again hasn't really been addressed yet.
Oh, that's great. That is creating an opportunity once that was
big opportunity.
That would be great. Well, Doug, thank you so much. Before we end, I'd just like to ask you that the second session of the UN Plastic Treaty Committee is coming up in basically a few weeks, almost in May in Paris. What would you either think would come out of here or like to come out of this next session?
Well, I would like to see, I think there will be different factions of different countries aligning with each other around things, like I said, how will it be enforced? Is it going to be more punitive in taxation and banning and stopping? There's certainly some countries that want that. There's other countries that want to keep producing all the time, but they want solutions, and helping the solutions. So we have to figure out how those countries who are producing and have money are able to spend. This is where EPR comes in, extended producer responsibility. Someone has to be putting money on the table for the right to produce and sell this material. If there's no money in the system, the municipalities and the local governments do not have the funds to take care of all of this problem. So we all have to be adults here and put money on the table, make a level playing field, and create money and resources from the use and sale of this material that will be used to fund all these million machines that I talked about, and the infrastructure and the capacity to trade it legitimately and get it to the places where there's economy of scale and proper processing for for the big brands to use it again. And then not just the big brands, there will be medium and small size companies too, who all want to be, ahead of the game and the environment these days. So we have to give them the chance to do that.
Well, thank you. And at least, with these companies coming together, this first treaty to bring the world globally around this issue that affects all of us on so many levels. Very hopeful for the future and the future of plastic, something that you have been working on for decades, a pioneer in this space. So look forward to having you keep the audience posted. Really appreciate you being here, Doug.
Thank you, Karen. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Doug Woodring, thank you for joining me. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. If you enjoyed the conversation, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. Hope to see you next time. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.